All right, well, now that the first semifinal debate has concluded, we welcome the debate teams that will compete in the second semifinal round. Blue Valley High School of Stilwell, Kansas, and Carroll Senior High School of Southlake, Texas. At this time, I'd like to ask the debaters to please introduce themselves.
Hello, I'm Ava Slinia. I'm a senior at Blue Valley High School.
I'm Akil Reddy. I'm also a senior at Blue Valley High School.
I'm Varun Rastogi. I'm also a senior at Blue Valley High School.
I'm Amber Lynn. I'm a freshman at Carroll Senior High School.
Hi, I'm Nathra Thumalapalli, and I'm a sophomore at Carroll Senior High School.
Hi, I'm Anushka Velala, and I'm a sophomore at Carroll Senior High School.
Let's give these students a round of applause. Well, once again, moderating this round is Mr. David Baker, Director of Financial Aid and Admissions at St. Mark's School of Texas. And now to introduce our judges. Mr. Will Brewer is a partner in the New York office of Brewer Attorneys and Counselors. He regularly provides counsel on a diverse array of matters, including business torts, breach of contract, employment discrimination, intellectual property, and legal ethics. Mr. Brewer began his career as an associate at Walgacho, where he practiced complex commercial litigation with a focus in entertainment and media. He also contributed to amicus briefs submitted to the Supreme Court. He received his JD from New York University School of Law in 2014. Mr. Marshall Donut is the former Vice President and Senior Counsel for Marriott International. Prior to this, he served as Vice President and Associate General Counsel for Starwood Hotels and Resorts Worldwide. Prior to joining Starwood, he was the General Counsel for the North American Division of Club Med, Inc., headquartered in New York City. He also served Associate Counsel for Pan American World Airways. Mr. Donat is a longtime supporter and judge of the IPPF. Mr. Trey Smith is the Executive Director of East Mountain High School, one of the top charter schools in the nation. He also serves as president of the New Mexico Speech and Debate Educators Foundation, which has secured over $750,000 in legislative appropriations for debate programs in New Mexico during just the last 4 years. For over a decade, Mr. Smith served as New Mexico District Chair of the National Speech and Debate Association. A two-diamond coach with the NSDA, Mr. Smith coached over 100 students to the national tournament. He has also coached multiple teams to the Elite 8 rounds of the IPPF. He also serves on the IPPF Advisory Board. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for our judges. A quick reminder to please silence your cell phones. And with that, I turn things over to Mr. David Baker.
Thank you, Andrea. We'll start with the affirmative opening statement for a period of 8 minutes. You may begin.
In a world where some possess a surplus of medications while others lose their lives to a lack of the most basic, it's time to reevaluate our priorities. More than 1/3 of humanity suffers from inconsistent access to essential medicines, according to a recent study from Yennett et al. The trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, also known as the TRIPS Agreement, established stricter protections for intellectual property protection, especially for life-saving drugs. But the 2001 Doha Declaration also made it clear public health must come before intellectual property. Everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status or country of origin, deserves access to life-saving medications. The question in today's debate therein lies in whether society chooses to respect that right. Let's begin with definitions and framework. This round should be evaluated on which side best preserves human life and well-being, a standard recognized by the United Nations as the foundation of human rights. Intellectual property rights are best defined as patents, trademarks, and copyrights that confer exclusive rights to utilize one's creation for a given period of time, according to Saha and Bhattacharya. This includes the potential to renew property rights to prolong the protected status and maintain absolute distribution, production, and pricing authority of a product. Equitable access means timely, affordable availability for all populations in need. Our burden, as the affirmative, is to prove that prioritizing access yields more societal benefit than prioritizing IP, or intellectual property, which we'll do with 3 main contentions. The first of which is public health. The World Health Organization, or the WHO, reports that over 2 billion people lack access to affordable medicines, many of them protected by IP. Professors Baker and Thrasher write that patent monopolies block generics and drive up costs in countries that need these drugs the most. In fact, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2565 recognizes that poor public health can exacerbate armed conflict with detrimental humanitarian impacts. Improving access to a mere 201 essential medicines in 64 low and middle-income countries could avert 1.4 million premature deaths annually per a Warts et al. Study. Therefore, prioritizing equitable access truly means prioritizing human lives. On the contrary, COVID-19 proved that IP protections delay pharmaceutical access, especially in terms of vaccines. Kohler et al. Write that only after the WHO waived TRIPS rights in 2022 could countries like India and South Africa finally begin mass producing vaccines for their citizens. It's only when IP protections take a step back that we're able to increase access and save lives. Because ultimately, a plethora of pharmaceuticals are fruitless if they're not accessible to those who need them most. Our second contention is innovation. Although strong IPR is often touted as essential for innovation in pharmaceuticals, empirical evidence proves they hinder innovation by reducing technological opportunities, harming market competition, and slowing new drug development, according to Dosi et al. In the context of the pharmaceutical industry, intellectual property rights are less a catalyst for innovation than a legal barrier that inhibits innovation through monopolization. Empirically, pharmaceutical companies strategically aim to maximize the scope of potential infringement when securing intellectual property rights, indicating a profit-oriented motive rather than a people-oriented one. A phenomenon called product hopping, where pharmaceutical companies patent clinically insignificant adjustments to pre-existing drugs to extend their IPR protection, allows them to effectively monopolize their product. As corroborated by Heller and Eisenberg, this notably hinders follow-on research and product development, minimizing innovation across the board. Companies also create patent thickets, an insurmountable barrier of patents covering every aspect of a new drug, from the compound itself to its delivery, that practically grant them monopolies on treatment, preventing low-cost generics from entering the market and precluding follow-on innovation. At present, America's 10 best-selling drugs hold an astonishing average of 74 patents each. AstraZeneca employed this tactic to replace Prozac with a minimally modified alternative, Nexium, a product hop that cost the US healthcare system over $2 billion annually. This tactic is economically devastating, allowing large pharmaceutical companies to stifle innovation and preventing startups from producing new drugs, according to Bro in 24. Placing intellectual property rights above the human right to health creates a dangerous precedent that threatens to fracture the international community. Contreras explains it signals that maximizing concessions extracted from pharmaceutical innovations should be prioritized over actually ensuring that individuals have access to those very innovations. Progress is not the goal for intellectual property right protections, but rather profits. It's our ethical imperative in today's debate to prioritize equitable access instead, and in turn protect human life. Our third contention is economic stability. Equitable access to pharmaceuticals is crucial for safeguarding not just human, but economic health. Expanding access to life-saving medications helps mitigate the devastating effects of public health crises like COVID-19, reducing the economic burden on small businesses, preventing inflation spikes, and improving overall financial security, as stated by Yi et al. WHO studies show that more equitable access to vaccines could have accelerated the post-COVID-19 global recovery by months, preventing additional small business closures and adding $38 billion to each country's GDP forecast. But with absolute authority, courtesy of IPR prioritization, companies aren't focused on accessibility. Private sector giants like Pfizer and BioNTech delivered under 1% of their total vaccine supplies to low-income countries. And Moderna delivered less than 0.2%, according to Neeraj, meaning strong IP protections preclude access to pharmaceuticals for people from low-income countries, and in turn, create economic repercussions that ripple around the world. Another critical aspect of prioritizing equitable access over intellectual property rights is the issue of price gouging, especially for life-saving medications like insulin. In the current system, pharmaceutical companies can inflate prices far beyond production costs, placing significant financial burdens on individuals, families, and governments, as explained by Raj Kumar. But according to Ahmadian and Nikfar, pharmaceutical companies' revenue far exceeds their R&D expenses by over $240 billion. Yet, despite their profits, in the US today, 1 in 4 insulin users has to ration their doses due to the extreme prices, according to a study conducted by the Yale Diabetics Treatment Center. Prioritizing intellectual property rights doesn't fuel innovation. It forces people to choose between medicine and survival. So, in conclusion, it's about time we prioritize human life at the global scale. That means valuing equitable access over stringent IP protections, valuing people over profits. When intellectual property protections stop being our utmost focus, we can ameliorate public health, ensure pharmaceutical developments are truly innovative, and secure our economic stability. So let's do it. Let's focus on our most ethical and compelling priority for today: equitable access to pharmaceuticals.
First speech from the negative. Speech is for a period of 8 minutes. You may begin.
In a world where lives depend on the next breakthrough, we must champion policies that work in practice and not just in theory. Because the pragmatic realities of global health demand solutions that are effective, scalable, and forward-looking, I'm proud to stand and firm with the negation. Firstly, on some framework and clarifications. First, it's important to note that IP rights can coexist with policies like voluntary licensing and tiered pricing. Voluntary licensing is an agreement in which a patent holder permits another party to produce the patented product, often under agreed terms to increase access to the product. In fact, between 2013 and 2019, several major companies, including Pfizer and AbbVie, have engaged in voluntary licensing agreements to license their HIV and HCV products to over 100 nations, a practice that is actively on the trend of increasing. Then, tiered pricing is a framework where pharmaceutical prices are adjusted based on country and population incomes, enhancing affordability without undermining IP protections. These practices are becoming more common in an effort to expand their market base, thus demonstrating that the inherent purpose of IP rights is not to strip people of access to medications, but rather to ensure that innovators are fairly compensated. IP rights and equitable access, therefore, are not mutually exclusive. But then secondly, to prioritize is to arrange in order of importance. As a result, our arguments will be evaluating the distinct benefits of IP rights while also explaining why it is acceptable and even necessary to sacrifice some degree of equitable access in the short term for greater long-term gains in public health, innovation, and systemic sustainability. We don't regret access, but we argue that deprioritizing IP is ultimately more harmful. But then lastly, we believe that this debate should be evaluated under a utilitarian framework. The purpose of the pharmaceutical system is to save the greatest number of lives, both now, but also in the future. This framework evaluates the long-term health and innovation outcomes of competing worlds. The burden crystallizes as such. Whichever side can prove that their world firstly creates the most robust healthcare system in terms of adaptability and innovation, but then secondly saves the most amount of lives should ultimately win this debate. On our first contention, innovation. Prioritizing IP is essential for fostering innovation. In the pharmaceutical industry, the private sector provides over 87% of global R&D funding. IP rights enable cost recovery by granting exclusive marketing rights, meaning that pharmaceutical companies can profit from the development exclusively. For example, Gilead was able to make a cure for hepatitis C due to recouped costs. Without IP, competitors could simply replicate drugs without bearing R&D costs, reducing the incentive to even develop these new treatments in the first place. But then, a single new drug costs pharmaceutical companies on average $2.6 billion a year and decades to develop. Big Pharma needs to recoup the cost of innovation. Therefore, without exclusivity, there's a very low probability on the affirmative side of the house that bold R&D would occur. For instance, in India, weak IP laws meant that companies prioritized generics over innovation. Therefore, during COVID-19, India struggled with access and innovation, while IP-backed firms were able to deploy mRNA vaccines more rapidly. IP protections labor-enabled broader access through licensing and scaling. scaling. On the affirmative, companies would avoid risky innovation without exclusivity guarantees. Having large amounts of R&D innovation is a prerequisite for actually obtaining this innovation. IP rights, furthermore, facilitate secure knowledge sharing through licensing agreements. This is why during the HIV crisis, pharmaceutical companies engage in unprecedented collaboration while still protecting their IP. Licensing agreements enable the scaling up of vaccine production globally without disincentivizing these innovators. IP helps in two key ways. Firstly, on rare diseases. Developing treatments for niche diseases involves high risks and high costs. Without IP, companies neglect these areas. Look towards the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, which IP protections were able to be utilized for rare diseases, and 650 new drugs were produced because of this exclusivity. Speed on global crisis. In emergencies, rapid R&D is vital. Companies like Pfizer and biotech entered into agreements with manufacturers worldwide to produce and distribute vaccines, saving over 24 million lives in the span of just 8 months. But then on our second contention of optimizing quality, sustainability, and preventing counterfeits. Firstly, on quality. Without robust patent protections, pharmaceutical companies lack the assurance that their R&D investments will be recouped. This uncertainty discourages them from allocating significant funds to R&D and implementing advanced manufacturing processes that ensure high quality and efficient medication. For instance, in Brazil, when it weakened its IP laws in the early 2000s to prioritize access, this led to widespread inefficiencies in the pharmaceutical production of this nation. But then secondly, on counterfeits. IP helps fight counterfeits. Legal protections occur when you have more IP rights, thus giving the companies the power to enforce their own authenticity. In developing nations where access is prioritized over quality, counterfeit drugs make up 30 to 75% of the market. However, when you have strong IP rights, nations with these IP rights see this number being less than 1%. In Nigeria, poor IP enforcement meant 40% of the pharmaceutical market consisted of counterfeits, often worsening health outcomes for the average person. But then on sustainability, IP-funded profits allow investment in environmentally friendly production. For instance, GSK's Operation Sustainability initiative reduced emissions, water use, and waste, funded by profits because of these patented drugs. Then on our contention tree, paradoxically undermining equitable access. The affirmative is wrong to claim that IP is the main barrier for equitable access. Over 95% of essential medications are currently off-patented, yet 1/3 of the global population lacks access. In parts of Africa and Asia, half of this population faces this reality. The nation wins because strong IP allows firms to scale up production, increase supply chains, therefore increasing access. Innovation, furthermore, it reduces prices over time. For example, Gilead's HIV drug dropped from $40,000 annually to just under $40 because of these R&D advancements. This price drop couldn't have occurred without initial IP production and the incentive to innovate. The arbitrary idea of equitable access that the affirmative pushes paradoxically undermines equitable access in the first place. This argument can be understood through two main layers. Firstly, on research constraints. When you prioritize equitable access too much, governments and companies aren't able to recoup costs for production, meaning that the supply and investment of drugs in the first place goes down. This is why when Venezuela had universal access policies for their healthcare system, we saw 85% of essential drugs becoming unavailable and underutilized. But then secondly, on foreign dependency, weak IP laws discourage investment in local capacity building. India, before adopting the TRIPS compliant laws, saw short-term gains but lost innovation momentum in the long term. Pharmaceutical and biotechnological companies are less likely to invest and export into countries where they know their IP can't be protected. Countries with weaker IP receive significantly less R&D in clinical trials. Therefore, IPR is a prerequisite for ever having a robust healthcare system and maximizing lives saved in the long term.
Now have a short 90-second preparation period for the affirmative, followed by the second affirmative speech. second speech from the affirmative team for a period of 5 minutes. As soon as I get it to there. Okay. You may start when ready.
Top level, you're voting affirmative today because we win that prioritizing equitable access saves more lives while enabling long-term innovation and economic stability. We've proven that equitable access isn't just a moral imperative, it's a structural necessity for a better, more resilient world. Let's start on framework. We agree that you evaluate this debate based on human lives first, a utilitarian framework. But on the framework and defining terms page, the negative articulates that voluntary licensing and tiered pricing can exist within their world. However, this simply isn't true. Both of these processes are methods of prioritizing equitable access over intellectual property rights. IPR involves exclusive rights over pricing and licensing as we defined in Ava's first constructive. However, sharing secrets through licensing and lowering prices for low and middle income countries through tiered pricing are examples of prioritizing equitable access over IPR. Don't let them access advantages over this. If they defend this, it only proves that you need to be prioritizing equitable access to pharmaceuticals over IPR. Next, we'll move on to our public health advantage. Patents restrict access by blocking generic competition and raising prices, especially in low and middle income countries. The World Health Organization has reported over 2 billion people lacking access to essential medicines, many of which are still patent protected or priced out due to monopolies. Expanding access to 201 essential drugs could save 1.4 million lives annually. The negative's argument that patents help access is backwards. You don't need innovation that people can't afford. You need access that saves lives. Access is a prerequisite to health. Next, on innovation. Bottom line, strong IP protections reduce, not increase innovation by deterring follow-on research and creating monopolies that block technological advancement. Our evidence that Ava brought up in our constructive shows that strong intellectual property leads to fewer exploitable research opportunities and less diverse innovation. One of our biggest examples is that Moore example. It's a 2000 study on the human mutation database and proves how costly patent-heavy environments kill collaboration. In the early 2000s, groups tried to work together to come up with the human mutation database to help study the human genome and prevent future diseases. But strong IP laws prevented this from occurring. Meanwhile, during COVID, in a big crisis, open access to the virus genome, i.e. prioritizing equitable access over patents, enabled the fastest vaccine development in history. Bottom line, innovation thrives in open, accessible systems, not in IP silos. You can't patent progress if you've already killed the process. Additionally, they say that patents spark research and development, but real-world data contradicts this. The same Moore human genome study proves that it collapses under IP burdens, meaning that research and development is impossible when the patents are stifling it in the first place. Additionally, we'll extend the product hopping argument from our first speech, that companies like AstraZeneca easily build up tickets, filing tens if not hundreds of patents on every step of a process, costing small businesses and the US healthcare system billions of dollars. Evergreening, too, allows extending exclusivity and delaying generics in the market. Coupled with acts like the Hatch-Waxman Act, preventing companies from filing for generics for over 20 years, these tactics stifle small businesses and startup innovation. Ultimately, they all work together to prevent any new companies and investors from getting into the game. That stops any innovation and investors in the future. In response to their incentive to innovate argument, the negatives analysis on the US COVID response here is inaccurate. One small part of the TRIPS agreement allowed for info sharing and licensing during a time of crisis, as I explained before. That's what led to Pfizer and Moderna working together and solving. Ultimately, that proves that more info sharing on essential medicines is key. The only way to solve crises like COVID is through the world of the affirmative. Now, the negative argues that generics are bad and cites an India example. However, we have our own empirics with India, which disproves the collapse myth. Before India started even focusing on increasing their own patents reforms, Indian generics supplied HIV meds to 80% of the global south, saving millions. Innovation continued globally, proving that companies still have incentives even with minimal patents. In response to their necessity for incentive argument, on niche diseases, companies will only focus on the most profitable areas in the status quo. Even in their own examples, companies only made acquisitions because it initially looked profitable for their patents. And on global health, COVAX's success proves that prioritizing equitable access during a pandemic is key to solving global health crises. We'll extend economic stability. The access to medicines is an economic investment. Equitable COVID vaccine distribution could have added $466 billion in global revenue by 2025. Denying medicine to low and middle income countries delayed recovery, increased inflation, and devastated small businesses. In contrast, allowing countries like India to manufacture generics will help stabilize their economies and prevent price gouging. In response to their optimization argument, we argue that the key issue with the Brazil example is that HIV and AIDS medication failed solely because of existing inefficiencies in pharma production. It's not related to patents, and will turn their argument that reinvestment is a myth. Thus, that means that we solve an optimization.
Yeah, 90-second preparation period for the negative prior to their second negative speech. 90 seconds. I have the second second negative speech for a period of 5 minutes. Give me just a second. I got to get this reset. You can start. Go ahead.
Every breakthrough drug starts with a risk. Years of research, billions in investment, and no guarantee of success. Prioritizing intellectual property protects that risk, ensuring the engine of medical progress keeps running. So proud to negate the resolution. So first, in this speech, I'll be going over some notes on framing before going over their case and then going over ours. Firstly, we both sides agree on the burden, but let's go over the clarifications. They told you that on our side of the house, we can't access things like voluntary licensing and tiered pricing because they say that supports their side of the house, and that supports a world where we deprioritize intellectual property rights. This simply isn't true. Why is this not true? It's because voluntary licensing is actively happening when a company already has a patent on something, they're voluntarily doing it, they're not deprioritizing their intellectual property because they still have the patent, they're choosing to do it, that exists in our world. But second then, tiered pricing is also still a company's decision. It's the company's decision to price something higher for people who are at a higher price bracket and price it lower for people who are at a lower price bracket. That's a company's decision that doesn't deprioritize their intellectual property rights in order to prioritize equitable access. It's something that can exist in our world. But then, let's go on their contention one on public health. They say that access is a prerequisite to health. However, we can prerequisite their prerequisite because having innovation in the first place and a proper funding mechanism is a prerequisite to access occurring in the first place. All of their arguments fall flat insofar as they can't prove to you exactly how they're funding innovation happening in the first place. They talk a lot about crisis management and things like that, but understand that especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, companies needed that guarantee of exclusivity to even make the vaccine and accelerate development in the first place. The lack of that being there would mean that access can't even be a concern if the drug doesn't exist in the first place. But then, they talk specifically about patent monopolies. Firstly, they don't explain to you what extent these monopolies exist for. At our best world, these monopolies exist at max for 5 years, because even when exclusivity exists, this doesn't mean they can price gouge, because we have a highly competitive market in our world. Why is this true? This is true because when you have a lot of different companies trying to vie for a new exclusivity through getting a patent because they are inherently profit-driven, like they agree, understand that they will be wanting to make improvements on the drug, leading to more competition, leading to the old innovations having to decrease in their prices, even when they do have exclusivity. This happened with an insulin variant called Lantus, where even though they gained exclusivity, only within 5 years they did have to decrease their prices because of the competitive market that is only generated on our side of the house. But then, on COVID-19, they say that delayed pharmaceutical access only happened when IP was super prevalent. We can turn this example completely on them, because understand that the TRIPS agreement is something that's part of IP rights and that's strengthened by IP rights. Pfizer and BioNTech took part in doing this collaboration only through IP facilitated licensing agreements that exist more on our side. But then on their contention too of innovation, the problem with this contention is that they don't actually explain to you how they're going to improve this. They don't give you a mechanism on how they're going to improve innovation. The only business model that sustainably works to be improving innovation is our world on the negation, because we told you that 87% of innovation in the status quo is funded by the private sector. Insofar as they're diminishing the private sector's incentive to continue investing this much, they can't possibly win their innovation argument. But then, what do they say specifically on why we can't access innovation on our case? They say, one, on patent thickets. Sure, they exist, and we agree that they do exist to some extent. However, the problem isn't as bad as they seem, because in examples like Humira, where it did have patent thickets, there were still biosimilars that existed, there was still competition that existed because they had to be improving on that drug. The fact that patent thickets existed didn't actually stop innovation. They can't get away with that. But then the next thing then on evergreening. Evergreening occurs because you create a new drug and then you patent that new drug. That means the exclusivity is lost on the old drug you had. So that old drug now doesn't have exclusivity, generics can flood the market, and innovation can happen. But then, on their argument of economic stability, we can respond to this because IPR and innovation is a prerequisite to access even occurring in the first place. Their mechanism to access economic stability is accessibility, but insofar that we can access that better through our prerequisite and also our case material, which I'll be extending now, we're winning that also. Because in our case, we told you that in order for accessibility to occur, you need to be incentivizing these companies to then go into other places, and also decreasing dependency that less developed countries have on more developed countries. That's a direct turn on their case. At the end, it's very simple. As long as we can create a world where innovation is maximized and competition is fostered, breakthrough drugs are created, and access can be sustainably given, you vote on the negation.
We will now have a 10-minute period of cross-examination between teams. Captains, please pay attention to this. That keeps me from interrupting, okay? Which means everybody gets to ask a question, everyone must answer one. And so we'll go back and forth until that's accomplished, and then we'll kind of see where it goes, okay? So if y'all pay attention, I can just sit and watch. Thank you. Start with the affirmative asking a question of the negative. You can start.
I'll begin, thank you. Given that Hatch-Waxman guarantees patent protection for at least 20 years, how can you make the claim that a patent monopoly or any monopoly on IPR only exists for 5 years?
The reason we can claim this is because we were talking to you specifically about price decreases. Price decreases occur even when companies have exclusivity because of the large levels of competition we generate on our side.
Question from the negative to the affirmative.
I can ask a question. In our first speech, we told you that currently 95% of patented drugs are inaccessible to a third of the world's population, proving that IP isn't the main barrier for inequitable access. How then does the affirmative achieve solvency for equitable access?
So we'll start with the COVID-19 pandemic as a great empiric. One of the bigger problems with even given the state of equitable or of medicines being patent versus unpatented in the status quo, should something as large as a pandemic, which we can see as plausible as having occurred in 2020, emerge, there will immediately be a patent race to for any possible vaccine. And as a result, unless we have initiatives like we saw in 2020, like COVAX, that ensure licensing agreements, it won't become accessible to anybody, meaning that the best path to equitable access, particularly when we see the threat of pandemics as being omnipresent, is ensuring, or the best path is ensuring equitable access when we've seen the threat of pandemics as being omnipresent.
Question from the affirmative for the negative.
So, in your previous speech, you mentioned or concurred that most pharmaceutical companies are profit-oriented and profit-driven. Knowing this, why would pharmaceutical companies want to sell their products at lower prices, therefore making far less profit, especially for low-income countries and their communities?
Okay, yeah. So essentially what you're describing right now is a tiered pricing. We tell you that we have access to this on our side because essentially a company always wants to price gouge so that they can get the most profit. Under a tiered pricing system, they're able to price gouge people who have the ability to pay for the high medicines, but they still get more profit because they can reach people in lower and more developing countries that don't have the same amount of money to pay for this. So essentially they're able to access more people. That's why they price gouge, and that's why they set prices at different rates depending on which area they're trying to target.
Question from the negative for the affirmative.
Yeah, so in the question that you just responded to about COVAX and COVID, we tell you that that's actually supporting our side of the house. If you're supporting that a licensing agreement should happen during a pandemic or something like that, where now companies can come together and collaborate, that only happens.
Need to ask a question.
Okay, yeah. So can you just expand on that, on how under COVID that wasn't part of our side of the house?
Sure, I'll take that. So we articulate that right now, the reason that happened during COVID is because of one specific part of the TRIPS agreement. While the TRIPS agreement might initially seem like it's focused on IP law, this part of the TRIPS agreement is basically going against the rest of IP, encouraging voluntary licensing and encouraging companies to work together. It's basically going against the rest of all of their patents. That scenario during COVID allowed us to see that this increased licensing of companies working together and not focusing on their IP is what really allowed us to create the COVID vaccine and increase access to it. That proves that even though it was technically created under IP law, it was working against IP law and focusing on equitable access. That's what we need to foster toward the future.
Question from the affirmative to the negative.
I'll take a question. So you claim that access to low and middle income countries can be increased by focusing more on innovation and private company patents. Can you walk me through how increased innovation will increase this access, and why haven't we already seen this happening in the status quo?
Yeah, so we told you about tiered pricing and why that uniquely gives companies an incentive to reach out to low and middle income countries. If you just have your market base solely being rich nations, you're not tapping into the market base of lower income countries. These companies would rather get some level of profit from low income countries versus having no level of profit at all, right? So why then is there incentive to not make some level of profit in low income countries? Even if it is comparatively less than richer countries, they're still gonna try to extend out their hand and actually reach out their hands in these low and middle income countries. This is why we actively see processes like tiered pricing increasing the status quo. Companies want to be actively expanding. They want to be reaching new markets.
Question from the negative back to the affirmative.
Without a proper funding mechanism, there's no way for innovation or accessibility to even occur. So without exclusivity to recoup costs, what is the incentive for profit-driven pharmaceutical companies to create more innovative drugs?
Whichever one of you hasn't answered yet, I think you all have, haven't you?
I can take this. I'm glad you brought up innovation. So in our first constructive speech, we explained how big pharmaceutical companies do a very good job of making sure that their patents cover every step of the process. And that includes many minute details, including ones that are clinically insignificant. In doing this, pharmaceutical companies are already making a very large profit. They're not incentivized to come up with new products because the ones they already have are making lots of money. And there's not competitors in the market who can viably compete with them because, again, the patent thickets ensure that no small startup or even other company can follow in suit or even make generic versions of the pharmaceuticals because of the 20-year limit that the patents have that's often extended. So in most cases, there is not a reason for pharmaceutical companies to make new pharmaceuticals.
Question from the affirmative to the negative. We have about 4 minutes left. Affirmative to the negative.
Okay,
Anybody?
I'll continue on the Hatch-Waxman line of questioning. Even if innovation itself is possible, post 5 years, like you claimed, given that the product itself cannot be marketed until the 20-year patent is expired, how can any possible competition be be given against companies that hold sole exclusive access, like we pointed to with AstraZeneca, Pfizer, et cetera.
The marketing constraints you're talking about are for the specific drug that was patented. If another company creates a similar drug or a drug that's actually an improvement, they can market that drug. I don't understand how that question makes sense or manifests.
Questions negative to the affirmative?
Yeah, so if the current drugs that companies are producing are bringing in enough profit, why are we seeing them innovate under COVID? Why are we seeing them innovate as soon as a new crisis arises?
I can take this. I think COVID-19 was a particular instance where we saw there was also government funding coming in. And in fact, for COVID-19, a lot of the patent restrictions that we traditionally see in the quotidian day were alleviated. So that allowed for different companies to be able to work together without the fear of intellectual property or exclusivity. So COVID-19 is a good example of how actually prioritizing equitable access and having the focus being making sure people have access to vaccines and pharmaceuticals can allow for innovation. Whereas in most other cases, there is not that level of advancement in research simply because there's not incentives coming from other sources, and there's strong competition to protect each company's patents, which effectively stifles competition.
Good place to stop. Question back the other way.
Okay. So going back to the LMIC's topic, can you give me one empiric case or give me an example where strong IP protection actually guaranteed access to low-income countries where they benefited from this?
I can take this. Look at the HIV crisis, when we actually saw that strong IP protections and having increased amount of innovation ultimately led to products being created that weren't actually being able to create in the first place. We saw increased competition, we saw decreased pricing. You wouldn't have even seen this drug being made in the first place without the exclusivity that the negation provided.
Okay, we barely have time for a question going back the other way.
I can ask a question.
Okay.
On foreign dependency, IP rights give the incentive for investors to actually go into developing nations and help develop their healthcare systems. Without exclusivity then, how is the affirmative ever giving any sort of incentive to have these companies actually want to invest in foreign nations?
So I think this also goes back to a question that was asked before. One thing that we need to be careful of is don't conflate the idea of equitable access meaning the removal of IPR. Like IPR can still exist in the world of the affirmative, it just prioritized under equitable access. And this will be litigated further on like the definitions and framework page, but the point being that IPR is still going to exist. Like companies will still have access to their inventions, but we'll see different measures under the world of the affirmative. We could see things like the decrease of the patent duration that I pointed to with Hatch-Waxman. We could see things like voluntary licensing. We could see things like compulsory licensing that weaken IPR a little bit. So companies, even if they are profit-oriented, they'll still continue to innovate post-affirmative. It'll just be prioritized through the world under equitable access. IPR won't come first, equitable access will.
We've got a minute. Let's try one more question back to the negative. Nope, nothing?
I have a question.
Go.
So for pharmaceutical companies, in terms of making profit with R&D, as you previously said, knowing that the average R&D cost is maybe 2.6 billion, but the average revenue is over 240 billion, how much do you think that pharmaceutical companies could decrease in revenue and still be sustainable?
So yeah, the revenue that they gain is because their drug is successful, right? In fact, the statistic that you just bring up further proves that companies want to do R&D because they get more in profits than they're spending on research. This is why research and development is so important, because it funnels new drugs and it creates enough money for them to continue doing this process over and over and over again.
Okay, we're going to stop there. We have 5 seconds left or so. So thank you. That'll end the team cross-examination period. And now we'll get to the main attraction here. Have the panel can ask questions, and again, we want to make sure that every member, that each member of a team has answered a question before they answer a second question. Okay, is everybody, we're all clear on that? Captains, you'll keep an eye on that. We'll go from there. Go.
Go for it. Sure. Does it matter which? For the negative first? So understandably, I think for both teams, but focusing on you, understandably, I think a lot of your examples cite evidence in response to like large-scale pandemics or health crises, COVID, HIV. Do you have evidence that also supports your stated goals of, your utilitarian goals of innovation and saving lives for sort of longer term thinking like diabetes, for instance, health issues.
Okay, so we proved to you how basically when you don't have drugs that are off patented, right? In the instance of insulin, we say that exclusivity that you have in the short term is necessary for creating the drug in the first place. Once you have that creation created, after the patents expire, we see a lot of competition occur, and that's when we see like prices actually go down on our side of the house. But we say the prerequisite is having that funding mechanism and actually having that exclusivity.
Sure, go ahead.
I want to follow up on that question. So insulin is somewhat of an example that's not typical. There are so many drugs that focus on narrow and obscure areas of illnesses. So how do you answer that when you have 20 years of, or whatever, extended periods of protection against equitable access because of price and other reasons for those other drugs?
Yeah. So in the context of rare diseases, I think the negation is actually pretty far ahead. Because let's look towards the affirmative world, right? There is no incentive to actually innovate on rare diseases if you're not uniquely able to recoup the costs, because rare diseases, A, affect a tiny amount of people, and also B, they just cost more to make, right? This is why we saw companies like AbbVie and plaque psoriasis, when they were actually able to create other drugs, they use the excess amount of profits to reinvest back into rare diseases, because they know there's a niche market for these rare diseases. People are willing to pay higher amounts of money, so therefore they're actually like investing in these like drugs, and they're able to create like diseases and like innovation for these rare diseases and have drugs being created. On the affirmative world, you're likely to just see like more generics being like pushed out because there's less of an incentive. We provide more of an incentive.
Thank you.
I have a question for the affirmative. When we talk about equitable access, how do we make sure that doesn't just turn into free public Wi-Fi? That's notoriously terrible. How do you make sure a system can still deliver and isn't sluggish, but it's still being accessed equitably?
Sure, I can take that. So one of the biggest ways that we can ensure this is by focusing on the wording of the resolution to prioritize. We're not entirely getting rid of IPR and leaving it for everyone. We're instead focusing specifically on equitable access just to ensure mainly that people in LMICs or low and middle income countries have easy access to important drugs that they otherwise wouldn't. It's mainly focused on essential medicines and important drugs this way. That way we aren't changing everything about every other patent. Breen, anything to add?
Can I follow up on that? So part of the argument for the affirmative there as well is that competition stimulates quality in the sense that if we do something that ensures equitable access, such as decreasing patent durations from that 20-year mark that I mentioned, then companies earlier on will have to compete and ensure that their product is the best that it possibly can be, instead of just sitting on a patent and not having to further innovate. And because of that continued innovation, because they have to consistently worry about beating competitors and bringing the best product to market, the quality of the product that ends up being that ends up taking up at least some part of the market will be as high as it possibly can be, because it's stimulated by competition.
Thank you. Question?
I have a kind of follow up for the negative. Since I did an F, I want to ask a negative question with a different sort of metaphor. How is protecting IP in this situation not like locking the fridge during a famine?
Yeah, so we tell you that IP actually has kind of like a trickle-down effect. Every single time you introduce a new drug into the market, all of the older drugs just like naturally will cost less because now you have another thing on the market. Just like an iPhone, right? An iPhone 16 costs more now than like an iPhone 14. But both are still having good quality. Both can serve people. So IP naturally reduces costs for a lot of older drugs, which means that you also in turn get to expand access to a lot of people. Their side doesn't really give you a mechanism on how people will be able to access drugs if innovation isn't occurring at the same rate.
This is, I think, an ethical question tied to an economic outcome. I think I heard the statistic 80% of innovation or research and development is funded privately. So by that, I'm not sure you agree with that statistic, but I'll hold that aside. So that means 20% is coming, what, from the public sphere, taxes? So from an ethical point of view, since taxpayers, including the underserved taxpayers, are footing the bill for at least 20% of these pharmaceuticals that might not be available to them. Is that ethically, how do you square that ethically?
This kind of relates to what my partner Amber was saying, but overall, innovation does help for the greater good of society, as you do see a trickle-down effect over time. You see older drugs become cheaper. That does have a trickle-down effect, providing them access in the long run. And also, during times of crisis, companies are encouraged to engage in things like voluntary licensing, and tiered pricing also does exist, like we've explained to you. That way, they are still gaining access in the long term, and we think that's really important.
I want to add on to what Nature was talking about. In terms of the ethical question it raises, I think we need to set a narrative of progress over perfection, right? There are a lot of systems in the status quo that don't provide people with perfect access, but we say having a system in the first place, having a proper funding mechanism to even create drugs in the first place, actually ensuring some level of innovation, actively having drugs being created is what we need to be striving for. You don't see it on the affirmative, so therefore, in terms of the ethical question, I think it becomes a comparative debate on which side comparatively just like has a better system. We comparatively had the better system insofar we had the system in the first place with our funding mechanisms.
Affirmative, do you think pharmaceutical companies are too greedy to be moral?
I can take this one. I think with patents, there's not a legal obligation for pharmaceutical companies to do what we would say is the right thing. And I think objectively looking at what pharmaceutical companies are hoping to achieve, which is profit, there's not something that necessitates these companies will be generous or that they won't go the path that produces the most profit. So I think a system that would prioritize equitable access has a better guarantee than profit companies or pharma companies alone being charitable and generous to low-income countries.
It's for the negative. Do you have a position on, or does your research indicate, like, for getting the goods that you want to get, right? The ones that you described that are the goals of the round, right? So what level of IPR is it? Like, is there an extent to which you say, okay, no, access actually needs to take priority? Is it 50 years, 80 years, 10 years?
Yeah, so we tell you that we think that IPR should exist so that a company can recoup the costs. So as long as they're able to recoup the costs and use that money to reinvest back into their company to funnel more innovation, we think at that extent IPR serves its purpose and it helps the greater good of creating new drugs and helping more people. After that, then I think it becomes an abuse of power, and I think that we all kind of maintain that sentiment.
Question for the affirmative. Sure. So you talked about the cost to develop a drug being something like $2 billion and change, and the profit being extraordinarily high, 100 billion plus. So that's the successful drug, right? What percent of all R&D of successful and unsuccessful drug expenditures are successful? Starting with that question. Is it a small amount? We're getting to significance here.
So even if we took, say, about 1 in 20 actually made it to market as successful, the first thing to note is that all $2.6 billion, 2.6, that much money won't be spent on an unsuccessful drug because in clinical trials, they'll realize that the drug isn't working, so any marketing expense will just not be included. But say even then that it was $2.6 billion to develop the drug, which it wouldn't be, but let's say it was, and only 1 in 20 drugs actually succeeded, we're talking about spending around $40 billion for just one drug altogether to succeed. Yet they're reaping profits of over $200 billion. Like, the deficit is just unimaginable, and clearly they don't need that much of a profit stance, especially when lowering that profit to some extent through voluntary licensing or through decreasing the patent duration could ensure equitable access.
So does that $200 billion go towards the other 19 unsuccessful R&D expenditures?
Based on our research, it would not be as much as $240 billion, but it would be an amount that would be able to compensate most of the expenses done.
That's my point, right? That you need that profit on the 1 in 20 to fund the other 19 that might fail, just so you get 1 in 20. How do you get around that? Why don't you need patent protection to get that money to fund all the unsuccessful ones to hit the jackpot with the good one?
Yeah, so part of it is that like they wouldn't see profits to the extent of $200 billion, but they might still see they still definitively would see profits that exceed that of their expenses, so they can still reinvest in the company to ensure that they find that 1 in 20. To be clear, we are not advocating for the destruction of IPR. Like IPR will still exist post-affirmative, just methods to create equitable access rather include decreasing patent duration, which might see their profit curtail if they aren't able to take it to market as quickly.
We would also articulate that right now, due to patent thickets within the status quo, we aren't even able to see that 1 in 20. The other 19 aren't even able to start an idea to get any money to market in the first place because any idea they have is being bought up by the bigger companies. More equitable access would allow those other 19 companies to even have a shot at going to market because right now, only the large corporations are even able to get an idea and take it to market in the first place.
And to continue on that, at least domestically speaking, the FDA's 4-step trial process, for most pharmaceutical companies, if they make it past the first or second trial phase, and there were a complication in the later phases, they would do a minimal amount of R&D and then continue on, and the majority of those pharmaceutical products end up being successful. So if the product were to fail in the first or second trial, the R&D costs would not be to an extent that it would be a problem in terms of recompensating the creators.
Additional questions?
Negative. If I invent a life-saving drug, but there is someone in Ghana who cannot afford it, am I a hero or am I a villain in that situation?
I'd say you're still a hero for making the drug.
Yeah, because eventually at some point that person will be able to afford it, whether it's through the creation of biosimilars that's done with the R&D that was created, whether it's through different mechanisms like voluntary licensing, tiered pricing. We have so many ways for people who are currently not served to be served. The affirmation gives you no mechanisms. They don't give you any methods into which people who are underserved will be able to get access to drugs like this that are created.
You said eventually, and I think timeline is going to be an important part of probably my ballot here and probably how this round gets synthesized. So I'm wondering if just you could both sides, like tell me in a sentence, who your side makes wait longer, a patient or a scientist?
I'd say our world does make the patient wait a little bit longer to some extent, but in their world, understand that the drug that could be saving their lives would never even be created in the first place. So they're basically just waiting for forever.
From our perspective, we would say almost neither. First, for the scientists that are hoping to innovate won't have to wait for patents to expire after 20 years because some company's just sitting on their invention. And also, patients will now get access to those much faster because we'll see things such as voluntary licensing and cross-licensing reach countries in need faster.
So I'd like to ask about the HIV medications and that whole time period. Is HIV medication an example of the voluntary licensing and the tiered pricing from the perspective of the negative?
There was an example of voluntary licensing in which Pfizer and Moderna did collaborate through IP licensing agreements for things like HIV and HCV. That was an example that did happen.
Okay, so from my understanding, there were many, many people, millions of people around the world that did not have access to the HIV medication for a number of years, time being the issue, cost. How do you square with that? You know, how significant is tiered pricing and voluntary licensing when you have a epidemic like HIV that was unaddressed and millions of lives were lost?
Yeah, so we would say that when it comes to something like a vaccine for HIV or medication, the reason why it's inaccessible is not because of patents anymore. Right now, there are basically no patents on vaccines for HIV, for things like malaria. Because they've existed for so long, the patents have run out, and so many companies have already created the same product. So patents are basically non-existent here. The reason why they're still unaffordable is because of distribution errors. It's because a lot of healthcare systems in developing nations don't really exist. So there is no way for people to access these drugs, but it's not because of patents.
Amber, but you're talking about vaccinations. I'm not.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
just in
talking about
medications.
medications.
Yes.
There are HIV medications that save lives.
Yes, of course. And those currently are not being patented. They're because they've already run out. They've already existed for decades.
Yeah, further on to that, I'd like to follow up on what she was saying. In fact, there's actually a WHO model formulary that for a lot of essential medications actually lists the formula right on there, which means all of this data exclusivity that they're talking about doesn't actually exist because the formulas are already so widespread.
Today.
Yes.
Any response in the affirmative?
Yeah. So we'd go back to the Hatch-Waxman Act that we mentioned earlier. That act explains that right now, when a company patents something like HIV medication or something else, they have exclusive rights to it for up to 20 years. On top of that, they have access to product hopping, where they can file another patent on top of something really similar to it, where they change just one aspect of the medication or something that's not even related to the medication, like the distribution, and file a patent on that. That lets them extend it. For HIV specifically, we could see that we mentioned earlier in our prior speech that India supplied over 80% of HIV meds to the global south. This was before they implemented more IP rights. Since in the early and late 2000s, India started going along more with TRIPS, implementing more IP rights. Until then, they were supporting much of Africa with these HIV meds because they focused less on patent rights and IPR. That proves that when we don't have to go along with Hatch-Waxman, with common IP law, we were able to save millions of lives in the global south.
And just to add on to that for a quick second, in Africa as well, like Akil mentioned, Africa was supported by India, but Africa also began to see generic production domestically after the expiration of those patents, because finally access to the research and access to the information was available for domestic producers to capacity build and produce those medications as well.
I'd just like to add that I don't think that the time from when a pharmaceutical was invented and when it becomes widely available is a matter of causation, but rather correlation. For instance, insulin was invented over 100 years ago, and yet because it is so heavily patented, it costs more than most people's paychecks. It's not heavily accessible for everyone involved. And I think in most cases, this is what we're seeing occur with pharmaceuticals, and it's an issue that demands we reprioritize access over the patents.
Other questions? Be good to direct one of the negative. Anybody?
I'm good.
Okay. We'll stop with that. Thank you, both teams. Well done. And we will then proceed to the closing statements by both teams. Both of these speeches are 5 minutes each, and these two speeches will conclude our debate. So, starting with the negative.
In a world racing towards the next pandemic or medical breakthrough, protection fuels progress. IP rights don't hinder access. They ensure that there is something worth accessing in the first place. I'm so proud to end the negations advocacy today. There are two main clashes in this debate that I want to fully flesh out. First is on innovation, and second is on access and affordability. On innovation, understand that innovation is a prerequisite to access. You need to be able to create drugs that people need and deliver them to people around the world. In order to keep up with changing diseases and healthcare crises, you need to innovate. And then the affirmation tries to tell you that companies don't want to innovate because the current drugs that they have are good enough to bring in enough profits. But again, companies, because they are profit-driven, want more profit. That's why they innovate. The only way to do so is through more research and development. And in fact, in questioning, they even tell you that the profit margins that companies bring in when they create a new drug are over hundreds of billions of dollars. Obviously, they want to innovate, and they're going to continue to do so when you prioritize IPR. Then they try to tell you that they shouldn't be making this high of profits. Know that it's more than just R&D that needs to be funded. It's things like educating, advertising, distribution, manufacturing. The $240 billion in profits that they're making is going towards every single step of their supply chain. That's why it's so important. But then they try to tell you that innovation doesn't matter if people can't afford it. Understand that the vast majority of people people can afford innovation. Innovation causes a trickle-down effect, like I talked about in questioning, which increases access in the long term. When new drugs are released onto the market, older drugs become cheaper. Innovation is the creation of drugs. It is just wrong to say that innovation doesn't matter, because then you're conceding that the creation of drugs doesn't matter. In that case, we win this round because at the very least, we are creating some drugs that some people can access. And innovation only happens in our world because our side is the only side that ensures that companies can afford to recoup their losses when they create a new drug. They give you 0 mechanisms in which private corporations can recoup costs. I haven't heard a single thing from their side that describes what sort of funding mechanism companies will get in order to create research and development and in order to create new drugs. This is why the comparative of this world doesn't even exist. If companies can't recoup costs, how are they innovating? How are they producing the drugs? And then most importantly, how are they actually giving them to people? Remember, pharmaceutical companies are profit-driven. They do things that maximize their income, and they will never be people-driven. That's why you need to work for them in a way that increases their profit, but also expands access. And the prerequisite to access and affordability, or even innovation, is having some sort of funding mechanism. In our world, the funding mechanism is private investment, which makes up about 87% of funding. However, without exclusivity, there is less of an incentive to even invest in the first place. Therefore, without this funding, no world on their side can be created. But now let's go look on affordability and access. Because our side is the only side that gets strong innovation, we also get strong affordability and access as well. Let's talk about some of the mechanisms that we brought up in our first speech, like voluntary licensing. The affirmation tries to tell you that voluntary licensing prioritizes equitable access. This is not true. Voluntary licensing is when pharmaceutical companies license their IP rights to other companies to reach areas that they can't reach. They're incentivized to do this because that means that they can make more profits by reaching more people. Access just comes as an impact of this. For example, Johnson & Johnson gives the Sertero, which is a tuberculosis medication, to over 134 developing nations that they couldn't access before. And it's been working because over 75% of people being treated for tuberculosis use the Sertero medication even in developing nations. The truth is, voluntary licensing is an effective way to reach more people while still allowing pharmaceutical companies to keep up their costs. Also, on our very lowest, even if we concede on innovation, remember when we told you in the one that over 95% of essential medications are off patent, yet 1/3 of the global population lacks access. Patents are not the problem that the affirmation wants them to be, meaning that the affirmation's impacts about producing vaccines that save lives and reducing armed conflicts aren't fixed because you don't actually address the issue. The reason why so many people don't have access to necessary pharmaceuticals is not because there are patents on them, it's because those countries don't have robust healthcare systems that can distribute them to the people that need them. Understand that once patents expire, we see massive price drops of up to 90% of more, making them affordable for everyone. Our world is the only world that can guarantee that the market can keep up with the crises, that companies can afford to stay in businesses, and that people will always be able to access the medication that they need. It's clear that you vote on the negation.
Final speech in the debate. This is the negatives of the affirmatives. Final rebuttal for 5 minutes. You may begin.
Every year, hundreds of millions worldwide are denied access to medications. They're not unavailable. Because of IPR, they're unaffordable. Ultimately, this debate is a question of what comes first, profits or people. On the definitions page, we agree that we'd evaluate which outcome best safeguards human health and well-being in the long run, but their voluntary licensing and tiered pricing arguments are inherently examples of why you should prioritize equitable access because they weaken IPR. IPR is the exclusive rights to one's own invention, and they've said the same. Sacrificing that exclusivity through voluntary licensing is inherently a weakening of IPR for the purpose of equitable access. That's an affirmative argument. It facilitates things such as tech transfers, which enables LMICs to expedite generic production. Just because it is a company's voluntary decision doesn't mean that it isn't a deprioritization of IPR and an embrace of equitable access. All the examples they cite are simply reasons why you should prefer equitable access. Then you're also voting on our 3 advantages, starting with public health, because over 2 billion people lack access to affordable meds, and the proximate cause is IP's monopoly. That's our Baker and Thrasher evidence. During COVID, we saw how waiving IP rights enabled distribution of the vaccine in India and South Africa, and similarly for AIDS, a low patent system in India, as well as the increase of generic production in Africa, enabled people to have access to these medicines because of the expiry of the patent. On innovation, America's top 10 drugs have an average of 74 patents, and any innovation that overlaps with those drugs in any ways is not permitted. That was our USPRG education evidence. That's why the Human Genomes database failed. It collapsed because of IP-related fears about information sharing. That was our Moore evidence. And we can see that it's purely a profit motive from companies. Companies can uselessly alter any one part of their drug and extend patent life, costing the US economy billions. That was our BRA evidence. And on economic stability, if not for patents, vaccine rollout would have been expedited to the extent of saving the US economy $466 billion. That was our Fairley evidence. Companies die on the stake of squeezing out every last dollar, with Pfizer giving less than 1% of their COVID vaccines to low-income countries for profit reasons. That was our Neeraj evidence. So the core of this debate on the innovation part comes down to them claiming that innovation is a prerequisite to access, but here's why equitable access is best for innovation. By prioritizing access, we actually increase innovation because equitable access solutions, such as shorter periods of market exclusivity, force brand name generic drug manufacturers to continue to lower prices and continue to innovate in order to stay competitive, rather than just complacently sitting on a drug monopoly. It forces them to innovate further. And then, post-affirmative, companies will still have their IP. That still enables them to make a profit and still enables them to raise funding. They'll just have less time to sit on it complacently, and they'll be forced to innovate further. Major profit margins, the $200 billion that we mentioned from the Ahmadiani evidence, proves that even if pharma giants lose out on some of those profits, they'll continue to innovate now at a higher level with more competitors, because there's still much profit to be gained. And the status quo prevents innovation through patents. Companies just extend the life of their patents without actually changing the product. Most extensions just extend protection without improving the product. That's our Gill evidence. Right now, companies are unable to sit complacently upon their patents without actually changing anything. Our outcome is the best for innovation. And companies will continue to innovate in LMICs absent patents or even with weakened patents. Again, there's profit to be gained there. So even if they are purely profit-driven, there's still major profit margins, so they'll continue to innovate there. Unlike in the IPO or overridden status quo, we cited the example of India, where over 80% of the vaccines provided over 80% of the vaccines to the global south under a limited patent system. This proves that access to medication only occurs in an affirmative world where IPR is strategically deprioritized. Now, let's focus on the timeline part of this debate. One of the biggest ways you should frame your decision right now is on time frame. The negative only helps some scientists right now while leaving patients in the dust indefinitely. We help thousands of inventors and scientists get into the market and increase pharmaceuticals immediately for everyone. And millions of people in LMICs have far faster access to essential medicines. You should default to our faster time frame on both fronts when writing your ballot. And then finally and overall, again, because we strengthen IPR through things such as voluntary licensing agreements, or strengthen equitable access through things such as voluntary licensing agreements, through things such as decreasing patent duration, this ensures that when these medications and these generics are produced in LMICs, not only can LMICs access them, but they can also capacity build, because now domestic generic manufacturers have the capacity and have the access to knowledge to build capacity within their own countries. We saw this happen in India. We saw this happen in Africa. Clearly, companies will still innovate because there's still profit to be gained, but LMICs will build capacity, and equitable access will be prioritized not only the wealthiest of nations, but also everywhere else across the board. Ultimately, you vote affirmative to put people before patents. Human lives should not lie at the feet of profit margins. Prioritizing equitable access enhances global health, incentivizes innovation, and is economically stabilizing. Overall, we encourage you to affirm because health shouldn't have to wait for a patent to break. Thank you.
Congratulations to our semifinalist teams. We will now give our judges a few moments to finish their ballots and let us know which team will move on to the finals, which take place at 3:30 today right here at the Harold Pratt House.